Before we get started, I just want to tell people a little bit about who you are, because you may not be as well known in the walking movement as you are in the justice movement.
Okay.
Don is a premier community organizer and activist. He's had a long history in the environmental justice movement, where he's worked across the world to support and develop healthy, just, and sustainable communities. He has a long list of accomplishments and involvements, including with the United Nations, the Clinton administration, and several multinational corporations. You can go online to get many more details. He's also the founder and CEO of Justice and Sustainability Associates in Washington, D.C., where he has lived for the last 4 decades. And he's someone that I feel honored to know. So thank you, Don, for joining us.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Easy to do, I must say. So you have a history of working with social and racial justice. We keep hearing that these are unprecedented times. How do you describe this time?
Well, I think this is another unprecedented time. It's for me the first opportunity to use those descriptive words in the 21st century. You and I have the benefit of being able to look back over our lives since in my own experience, and I know for you as well, I was conscious and alert and involved in the 60s and 70s. So I can look over the arc that has perhaps gotten us to this point. To answer your question, I describe this as a point of inflection and reflection in the country. And what I mean by inflection is that people are looking within in a very deep and personal and almost intimate way at what they value, what they believe, and how they act, how they behave. I think that's very inflective. The reflective part has to do with this interaction that we now see going on. It's the part that moves us from the internal conversations we have with ourselves late at night or early in the morning to what are the conversations we actually have in the real world with other people, in our families, in our neighborhoods, at our workplace. And then how do we actually operationalize some of those conversations? All you really got to do is look around, read the paper, look at the news, and you see people who are literally in movement. And that's where the term movement comes from, big M. When you talk about the big M movement, it's people are moving. People are moving about. They are agitated and agitating. And so I think we are in one of those special moments that have to do with now a kind of unity of purpose, clarifying internally where you stand, but also presenting to other people externally where you stand. I think people are really trying to be clear amongst themselves, within themselves, but also be clear with the external world they interact with.
Yeah, I think that's well said. What lessons have you learned in your career that can help us successfully grapple with these challenges that you've mentioned and get meaningful change this time? I know both of us feel like this has to be different this time. So help us make sure that happens. What do you know that we need to know?
Well, you and I have, again, talked a little bit about this question of what does it mean when you say this time you have to get it right? Well, first of all, if you live long enough, you understand that you make as much progress as you can make, but you do that every day. I mean, ultimately, when you and I show up, I think we have a sober appreciation for what we're going to accomplish that day. Now, that is just one part of the conversation and the equation, because if we look over the arc of our own lives, you, me, whoever's kind of going to look at this conversation, we also know that change is possible, but you got to look at it through the right arc. So I like to talk about between 1865 and 1965, you had the end of the Civil War, emancipation. 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act. That's 100 years. In that 100 years, the country had to go through the Great Depression. It went through Jim Crow. It fought world wars. And all of those processes, all of those events, if you will, have helped to create the world we're in today, for better or worse. Would we say that there was no change? Well, I certainly can't say that. I mean, I'm able to have this conversation with you as someone who was born under segregation in the South, and look at me today. Now, I believe that what we're coming against now is a recognition of the deeper dive that gets to some of the issues that have been around, well, frankly, since the country was created, before the country was created, because some of the racial justice issues started many years before the country was created. But it also goes back to this most recent period that we've been in, which I frankly call the test of will about democracy and the American contribution to an understanding of freedom. You know, there are many people who use the word freedom, but they mean different things when they use it. And, you know, when I use the word freedom, I think it's very different, for instance, from how some people in the administration, the current national administration, use it. And I would say that part of what we want to begin to do is not just ignore each other's definitions, but to talk with each other about those definitions. This kind of pulling back to our corners and just kind of dismissing the other corner is a threat to democracy, in my opinion. And it's only helpful when we actually come to each other and find some way and place where we can sit down and talk with each other about not our positions, but really what our interests are. What do we want? Because my experience is that most of the people in this country want the same thing. They just have different ideas about how to get there. I mean, everybody wants safe communities. Everybody wants their needs to be met, their family members' needs to be met. Everybody is basically trying to end up in the same place. The question is, how do you do that so that everybody part of it is served? That's the justice question.
Right.
The sustainability question is, well, how long does that need to last for? How do we make sure that we've invested enough over enough time to achieve that baseline, if you will? Mm-hmm. So I'm in favor of recognizing the wisdom of speaking and talking and engaging with people who I'm like, but also even more importantly, people who I may not be perceived as being like. You don't get anywhere by just talking to your choir.
Mm-hmm. Right. A really good point. And I think so many times our choir is what's comfortable.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Changing directions just a minute.
Okay.
I know you've been involved in a number of projects and programs over the years. Tell us about one that you're most proud of or where you think that you've had the greatest impact. What was that project and what made it successful?
Yeah, you said you were going to ask a hard question, and that is a hard question. Okay, well, I will talk about I will talk about a project that I'm still involved in, have been involved in now for 10 years. And it has to do with the role of Georgetown University in the District of Columbia, but more importantly, in its neighborhood. Most people would not recognize this, but Georgetown University has such a sterling world global reputation. But in the District of Columbia, there was a period of many decades when the university was actually a poster child for what were the worst town-gown relationships in the District of Columbia. That would come as a shock to most people. They said, that's impossible, not Georgetown University, not the Jesuits, not.
Right.
But the truth of the matter was that it was just, head-butting decade after decade. And the evidence of that was they just kept taking each other to court. The people who live in Georgetown, in the neighborhoods that are on the fence line of the university, and the administration of the university just were not on the same page about the role and contributions of the neighborhood, even the presence of Georgetown in the neighborhood and how it might grow. Georgetown was there before the neighborhoods grew up around Georgetown. So the idea that there were some people who really were disappointed or opposed to certain kinds of things that would happen at Georgetown, it really was evidence of tremendous miscommunication and lack of shared interests and understanding. No one had articulated a shared understanding or set of interests. So in 2010, I got asked to help resolve that conflict. I'd never been to Georgetown's campus. I did not know where Georgetown was, to be honest, having lived in the city for, at that time, 20 plus years. So since that time, since 2010, what we created there was an entirely new way to resolve conflicts. And the short story is, since 2012, Georgetown University has redefined and has become a national example of how different stakeholders, 3 separate neighborhoods, the university undergraduates, university graduates, and then because Georgetown has a partnership with the MedStar Health System, the hospital, which is Georgetown's medical school's training hospital, all of those stakeholders have come together in a collaborative way under the rubric of something called the Georgetown Community Partnership. And that partnership, which is now something we're doing at American University and other places, has become a real model of collaboration. And here's where I'll end it. In the 8 years now, since 2012, when the first agreements were being hammered out, this Georgetown Community Partnership has never taken a vote. We do everything by consensus. Takes a little longer perhaps, but the foundation that it creates for collaboration, very powerful. Now, this is what it delivered. There's an image. It's got the president of Georgetown. It's got the chair of the Advisory Neighborhood Commission, the Neighborhood Decision-Making Commission, and the mayor of the District of Columbia at the time. And they're holding their hands up, all joined above their heads. We call that the $1 billion photograph. Why do we call it the $1 billion photograph? It's because the ending of that conflict unlocked about $1 billion. It's probably more than $1 billion in resource to build things, to fund things, to grow, but now to grow collaboratively, to grow with input from everybody, to grow with the support of the neighborhood, and to take Georgetown now off its main campus to the new campus that they're creating called the Capitol Campus down by the US Capitol. So why am I talking about that? There are practical ways, they take time, that we can bring people together if they want to figure out where they share interests. And here was the bottom line. And this I think you'll find very relevant for your constituents. Georgetown wasn't going anywhere. The neighborhoods weren't going anywhere. What are you left with? Rational people can find a way to collaborate, but they have to work at it. And, you know, I'm very proud of that work. It is the kind of proof that I think matters at this particular time in our country, because there are people like you and me, and then there are other people who have other approaches and ideas. None of us are going anywhere.
Right.
We've got to figure out a way to work this thing out, which is not, to me, an avoidance of conflict. It is the work of resolving the conflicts.
Yeah. Were there a couple of things that you did or strategies you used to create the kind of collaboration you're talking about with Georgetown? Or was it just being in the room enough times, many times, that people said, okay, I give up?
No, yeah, so you put your finger on it. Yes, you have to be in the room a lot.
Yeah.
But then, of course, if people have been throwing rocks at each other for 3 or 4 decades, they can spend a year talking to each other. That shouldn't be such a hard thing to do. So if you think of it that way, the effort that takes place in resolving conflicts and reaching agreements is, first of all, a willingness to confront certain historical facts.
Yeah.
That isn't always comfortable.
Yeah.
There's a lot of finger pointing that can go on, but the truth of the matter is, once you elevate people's thinking above those events and recognize that you can't undo the past, you can acknowledge it, and you can reflect upon it in such a way that the present and the future are not constrained by it. But that's actually the real work. The real work is, okay, this may have been how we were, but the question is, we have a choice that we can make about how we want to be now.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't necessarily have to do it because we love each other. We have to do it because it helps us get what we want.
Yeah.
There's a big piece of self-interest in it. Now, the interesting thing is, as I said, people discover that they're not the only ones who want these things. Self-interest is typically more shared than people want to acknowledge. You can look at me and you can look at you and say, well, we don't have anything in common. Well, I'm confident that's not true. We probably have the majority of things that we want would not surprise each other. But, there's lots of people who will point to and say, well, you're not like her and she's not like you. And it doesn't matter where all of those differences add up. The real question is, so what? What do we want? What do we want now? It's not where we began. You and I began in different places. It doesn't matter where we began. Everybody has a beginning. It's where do we want to go? And actually, who do we need to help get there? I am pretty much, you know, if I do have a little bit of wisdom, I'm pretty confident that everywhere I want to go, I want it to work for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I guess we couldn't have this discussion if we didn't mention COVID. COVID-19 has changed how many communities are using their streets and to some degree their parking spaces. For some of us, that's sort of a welcome change. However, it also underscores the inequalities in access to safe places to be active. What do we do? I'd like for you to walk us through a Don Edwards plan for addressing the structural racism that has resulted in lack of access to safe public space for many communities of color.
Okay.
Do you want me to say that again?
No, because you might just like, you know, make me go mute. No, I get it, but here's what I would say, which I doubt is going to encompass everything that's implied in your question, but I'll give you a little bit. The reality is, and Kate, you may know, I think you know this about me, but I'm a public health person. I'm a trained public health professional, and that's my background. So COVID-19, the pandemic COVID-19 is not my first rodeo. Yeah. And I say that with a lot of regret because there's a lot that was preventable in terms of the impact this pandemic is having. You know, there's the virus, and the virus does what the virus does with human beings. We really can't mess with Mother Nature on that level. Mm. But the virus is not the same thing as the pandemic. The truth of the matter is that the pandemic is a result of human decisions and frankly, a lot of human mistakes. So there are a number of points when we look back in the future, we look back over the COVID-19 or we look at other pandemics and we say, if information had been shared, if people had told the truth, if the resources had been invested, so many points at which this now global pandemic, this global phenomenon could have been prevented from being a global phenomenon. So I think part of the question of structural racism, the structural changes that COVID-19 has raised, some of it's to basically say, we're gonna need to think things like the design of bathrooms, or design of homes, or design of our streets. We're gonna need to think about, is the way we've been thinking about the interaction of people in place or people in people, you know, how is that still appropriate? Because COVID-19 is not going to go anywhere, and if you pay attention to the virologists, there's going to be other viruses. Now, that's a structural thing that could be progress. It could mean that we actually are smart enough to respond to the opportunity to prepare and be in front of the next tidal wave. Mm-hmm. The other thing, though, that COVID-19 has pointed to, which is the sad part of it, is playing catch up is much harder when the horse has left the barn. So then the fundamental question structurally is, what do you invest? What's the institutional insurance you create in anticipation of the unknown but predictable event? Now, I think this is, for me, where we have a lot of difference in the country about the role of government. Somebody has got to have the preparation, and somebody has got to listen and be ready to say, okay, if the smart people, whether they're scientists or doctors or whoever, says that this is going to happen or it's likely to happen, these are the preparations that need to be made. To me, that's just rational behavior. Now, people will say, okay, well, now you're talking about real money. Yes, we are talking about real money. And I would put to everyone, we can spend it a little, or we can spend a lot more. And the costs of the impact of this pandemic on this country, but on the world, when you add it all up at some point in the future, you're going to be able to say, okay, this is the number of playing catch-up cost, but this was a projection of what it would have cost to be prepared, to be able to react and intervene better. And I'm pretty confident history tells us that playing catch-up costs more, costs a lot more. I mean, you read the news stories and you're talking about an economic recovery that will take decades. So, structural racism, well, dismantling that structure, not an overnight proposition. It's a 100-year proposition. But I think what's different today, Kate, is that we have more clarity about it's not going to just be done with some laws. All the legislation that was passed in the 60s, great. But we also got to change our hearts. And we have to change how we want to live. Part of what I've enjoyed in talking with you is we have to create new neighborhoods and new cities that aren't segregated. Mm-hmm. I don't want to walk through neighborhoods that aren't working for everybody.
Right.
People aren't going to walk if they don't feel safe. People aren't going to walk if they're just, die-hard automobile drivers. We have to create a way for people to see themselves in a place where it's working for them.
Right. That they're part of.
Walk around in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've looked back, so let's take a minute and talk about what you're doing today. Tell us a bit more about Justice and Sustainability Associates and something that you're currently engaged in.
Well, first of all, my colleagues who I am just honored to be a part of are very busy. This moment of inflection in the country, in Washington, in our neighborhoods, we are busier than bugs in a rug. And that's good, no complaint there. I think what we are trying to do, though, is make ourselves available as part of a vanguard that is trying to meet this challenge of serving and uplifting. This whole idea of JSA is, as a for-profit company, to actually follow a mission and achieve a vision. Our vision is actually, we create. Vision is one that was articulated many decades ago in this country. Martin Luther King, he talked about the beloved community. If you look at our vision statement, we're trying to help create beloved communities. No apology, no, that's what we're on record for. Mm. And so that actually fits right in with what people are raising questions about and probably more authentically seeking today. Mm-hmm. And so I'm happy that we're being called upon to be in these kinds of conversations right here. And we're being called upon by people who have never called upon us before. So that tells me that there are some breakthroughs occurring because we're now speaking to strangers who are saying, we heard about you guys, we have something in our heads we want to talk about. We have literally in the last 2 weeks been approached by people who say that exact words. And that basically means that people are moving. People are, as I said earlier, there's movement going on. There's movement building. And we're just going to try and keep up. We're going to try and serve and uplift as we go along.
Thank you, Don Edwards, for those amazing words of wisdom. And I love the beloved community. I'm going to borrow that one for sure. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today and share your life and some of what you've learned to help us deal with the current challenges. So thanks so much.
Hey, thank you for the invitation.